Hello again all. I thought today I'd explore the history behind the rhyme and round London's burning. Nowadays it's linked with the Great Fire of London of 1666, but it wasn't originally about London at all. So we'll look at the origin of the rhyme, and also a bit of the history of the Fire of London, and whether engines were fetched as the fire raged. The rhyme as it's sung today goes like this. London's burning, fetch the engines. Fire, 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 pour on water, and then it carries on in the round with London's burning. Originally, the rhyme was actually about Scotland burning, and I think if there'd been a copyright law in the 17th century, Scotland would have had a case against London. It's almost exactly the same rhyme and tune. This version first appeared in a parchment roll dated from 1580, but this was only rediscovered in the Library of King's College, Cambridge in the 1950s. The parchment contains 57 rhymes and rounds, but is completely impractical for the use as a songbook. It's 16 feet long and only 3 3/4 inches wide. These rounds were collected and gathered by one Thomas Lant, but despite extensive research looking through the lists of scholars enrolled in Cambridge at the time, we don't know who this Thomas Lant was. And in any case, he states that he was simply gathering the rhymes, so we'll never know for sure who actually wrote Scotland it burneth. However, given the parchment dates from 1580, it's thought the most likely fire it's referring to is the fire of Edinburgh in 1544. This is the time of the rough wooing, Henry VIII's attempt to subjugate Scotland under English rule and enforce the arranged marriage of Henry's son Edward to Mary Queen of Scots. Mary turns up in Mary, Mary, quite contrary, and I've put a link above. On the 8th of May, 1544, an English fleet mounted a sea-borne raid on the Scottish capital, which resulted in large parts of the city and surrounding areas being burnt and looted. It seems likely the rhyme was well known by the time of the Great Fire of London of 1666 and was adapted by later publications so that London became the version which we see later in nursery rhyme publications. The change in lyrics to fetch the engine opens up a whole series of questions about how fires were fought in 17th century England, and it's delving into history like that this channel is partly about. Did they actually have fire engines? And if they did, why was the Great Fire of London so, great? London had experienced many serious fires. The fire of 1212 destroyed London Bridge, and here's a link to that story in the rhyme. But the devastating fire that swept through London in 1666 was on a whole different scale. London in the 1660s had a population of over 500,000, but most of the people lived in the slums outside the city walls. Only around 80,000 people lived in the city proper. However, as a result of the fire, over 70,000 of them were made homeless. It destroyed over 13,000 houses, along with 87 parish churches. It tore through the financial heart of the city. The Guildhall was badly damaged, while the Royal Exchange and the enormous medieval Gothic St. Paul's Cathedral were both completely destroyed. The summer of 1666 had been long and hot, and when the fire famously started in a bakery in Pudding Lane after midnight on the 2nd of September, it raged for 4 days, fanned by strong easterly winds. Much of what we know about the events of the fire come from the diary of Samuel Pepys and the story of the mismanagement of the city fathers. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, apparently commenting upon seeing the fire on the first night that a woman might piss it out. Luckily, this advice of fire response did not make it into the nursery rhyme as we know it today. There were only very limited responses to a fire at the time. Local fire watchers alerted church wardens who rang muffled bells, which in turn alerted local people and the militia who would attempt to tackle the blaze. By law, the tower of every parish church had to hold equipment to support this effort. Long ladders, leather buckets, axes and fire hooks for pulling down buildings, and in normal circumstances this would suffice. In reality, this fire response hardly extended beyond moving water from a river or a local hydrant in buckets hand to hand in a line. And this was often ineffective as people prioritised their own property and belongings. There were so-called engines which were transported to the blaze, and these could then pump or squirt water in a small funnel. But these machines were heavy, slow, and required a team to operate. In most cases, these were local untrained volunteers. An alternative approach, and one which seems laughable today and must have seemed completely ineffective even at the time, was the fire squirter. This required 2 people to operate and squirted a small amount of water at the flames. By the 3rd day of the Fire of London, you could walk for 30 minutes from one end of the blaze to the other. Temperatures reached 1600 degrees. I can't help but feel that this response wasn't much better than the suggestion made by the Lord Mayor of London. There were limited fire regulations in place at the time. Buildings being made solely of wood and roofed in thatch had been officially prohibited in the city for centuries, but these rules were largely ignored. While in theory building materials such as wattle and daub were very good at stopping the spread of fire, a combination of cheap materials and poor maintenance meant that once a fire started, it was often able to run unchecked. Overhanging jetties may have been perfect for eavesdropping, but meant the fire could jump across streets. The main method of responding to a fire was to demolish houses to act as a firebreak. However, this was often done in an ad hoc manner. The authorities avoided pulling down houses of rich merchants for fear of financial claims, and when a house was pulled down using fire hooks and pikes, the materials weren't cleared away quickly enough, and so literally became fuel to the fire. As the fire entered its 4th day, there was a real danger it would engulf the Tower of London. The tower held the largest storage of gunpowder in the kingdom, and if it had ignited, it would have created one of the largest explosions ever seen in the world to that date, the equivalent of a minor nuclear blast, which would have engulfed the entire city. This information, understandably, focused the minds of the authorities, and resources were centred on the militia creating effective fire breaks through blowing up the buildings around the tower. Indeed, there's a case to be made that the rhyme, rather than fetch the engine, should read fetch the high explosives. In the aftermath of the fire, almost nothing of the old city remained, with a few exceptions. Here's the Stable Inn in Holborn. There were much stricter fire regulations. Brick and stone were the only building materials allowed. Overhanging eaves were out. No eavesdropping anymore. Buildings next door to each other had to be the same height. Parapets were required, and thick walls as fire breaks were built into new houses. These all combined to create an entirely new architectural style which came to define the late 17th century. The memory of the Great Fire was immortalised in the Doric column erected in 1671 and simply called the Monument. Designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke, it stands 202 feet high and 202 feet from Pudding Lane, the origin of the fire. The nursery rhyme too has become part of this process of remembrance. There's a plaque with the words of the rhyme ironically placed in the water fountain beside the column, and the words of the rhyme are also engraved on the granite seats around the square in which the column stands. The fire also saw the advent of fire insurance, with the creation of lots of competing companies, the first in 1680. People put insurance signs outside their homes to let firefighters know which houses were insured with which companies. There's some speculation online that fire engines and firefighters employed by the insurance companies would only respond to the house which displayed the company sign. This wasn't the case. If you called for the engine, it would come, whether you were insured or not. They were to charge you for the service. It wasn't in their interest to allow a fire in a house which was not insured to spread into one which was. The development of insurance and the industrial age saw the evolution of fire engines, the first ones being patented in the early 18th century. Which means the rhyme makes a bit more sense today when talking of fetching the engine. This also meant that outside of peacetime, there never was a conflagration like the Great Fire of London, and the rhyme today is just a bit of fun sung by children in the playground. Well, I hope you enjoyed this fiery tale. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Bye for now.